January 30th, 1944. Anzio beachhead, Italy. The pencil shook in Hedman Vera Hoffman's hand as he leaned against the cold concrete wall of his command bunker. Dust still drifted through the air, hanging like fog in the narrow observation slit. His ears rang, not from one explosion, but from the echo of something far greater, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. Hoffman pressed his eye to the periscope and stared into the gray smoke beyond the ridge. For 8 months, Bunker Louisa had dominated the valley below. It was a fortress of steel and reinforced concrete, 4 feet thick in places, built to withstand direct hits from 210mm shells according to strict German engineering standards. It had survived bombing raids, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults without serious damage. Now it was gone. Where the bunker once stood, there was only a massive crater filled with broken concrete, twisted steel, and drifting smoke. 32 men of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division had vanished in a single moment, erased as if they had never existed. No walls remained. No roof. No recognizable shape. Just a scar in the earth. Hoffman swallowed hard and wrote in his notebook, "The Americans possess artillery of unimaginable power. Bunker Louisa no longer exists." He had witnessed destruction before. He had seen tanks burn, villages reduced to rubble, and men torn apart by artillery. But this was different. This was not gradual destruction. It was instant erasure. A structure designed to endure months of punishment had disappeared with a single blow. The shell had come from far beyond visual range. There was no warning whine, no visible flash, only a sudden violent concussion that slammed into the bunker walls like a giant fist. Seconds later, the dust cloud rose where Louisa had stood. The shockwave rolled across the hills like an earthquake. German officers quickly confirmed the impossible. The bunker had been destroyed by one round fired from a new American weapon, the M1 240mm Howitzer, a super-heavy artillery gun making its combat debut with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion. Until that day, German commanders believed their fortifications were nearly indestructible. Concrete, steel reinforcement, deep earth cover, all had been carefully calculated. The West had relied on mobile warfare, while Germany perfected static defense. But in one terrible moment at Anzio, every assumption about fortification warfare collapsed. A weapon born from frustration. The story of the M1 240mm Howitzer did not begin on the battlefield. It began in 1940 inside American ordnance offices, where engineers studied reports from Europe. German bunkers in France and along the Atlantic Wall had proven difficult to destroy even with heavy artillery and bombing. The largest American gun at the time, the 155mm Long Tom, could damage concrete but could not reliably penetrate modern fortifications. The U.S. Army reached a blunt conclusion. If America ever faced fortified defenses on a large scale, its artillery would be insufficient. The requirements sounded almost impossible. The new weapon had to fire a shell weighing over 360 pounds. It had to reach targets more than 14 miles away. It had to penetrate 6 feet of reinforced concrete. And it had to be mobile, transportable by standard military vehicles, not mounted on railways like the massive guns of World War I. Engineers at WWII Arsenal in New York accepted the challenge. Years of design, testing, and refinement followed. What emerged was an engineering masterpiece, a gun weighing over 64,000 pounds in firing position, with a barrel 35 feet long and a crew of 14 men. The barrel alone weighed more than many tanks. Despite its size, the weapon could be deployed in the field within 8 hours. A specialized crane lifted the massive barrel into position. Crews dug recoil pits, assembled the carriage, and aligned the firing platform with careful precision. When operating efficiently, the gun could fire one devastating round every 3 minutes. Production began in late 1942. By 1944, factories were turning out more than a dozen guns per month. Each gun cost as much as 12 Sherman tanks, but the Army believed the investment would pay for itself in saved lives and faster breakthroughs. Arrival at Anzio. In January 1944, Allied forces were locked in a brutal struggle along the Italian coast. The Anzio landing had placed Allied troops behind German lines, but the Germans quickly surrounded the beachhead with fortified positions dug into hills and ridges. Interlocking bunkers commanded every road and valley. Any Allied movement invited deadly fire. The arrival of the 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions brought something entirely new to the battlefield. Soldiers watched in awe as the massive guns were slowly towed into position, their tracks biting into the muddy Italian soil. Engineers reinforced roads, widened turns, and strengthened bridges just to move them. Many infantrymen doubted the guns could truly make a difference. They had seen heavy artillery before. They had seen bombs fall from the sky. German bunkers still stood. Then came January 30th. At 14:30 hours, the Fire Direction Center transmitted the first combat firing order. The target was a German observation bunker on the Alban Hills. Coordinates were calculated using firing tables, meteorological data, and precise mapping. The crew loaded the massive shell using the crane, guided it carefully into the breach, and sealed the charge. The command was given. The gun fired. The blast slammed into the earth, sending dust and debris flying around the position. A deep thunder rolled across the valley. Seconds later, 14 miles away, the shell struck its target with catastrophic force. Observers confirmed a direct hit. The bunker ceased to exist. Shock and fear. German prisoners captured later that day spoke in frightened whispers. They described the shells as earthquake weapons. The ground shook violently for hundreds of meters around each impact. Some soldiers refused to re-enter bunkers after witnessing what had happened. Others abandoned fortified positions altogether. Major Herman E. Smith, commanding the 697th Battalion, recorded the psychological effect. After our first day of firing, German prisoners reported complete demoralization in their units. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Dozens of bunkers were engaged in the following days. Most were destroyed outright. Others were so badly damaged that their crews fled in terror. What had taken German engineers months to build could now be erased in minutes. For the first time, Allied commanders realized they possessed a weapon capable of not just suppressing fortifications, but eliminating them completely and reliably. A new reality of war. Back in his bunker, Hoffman closed his notebook slowly. He understood that something fundamental had changed. Concrete no longer guaranteed safety. Engineering no longer meant protection. The battlefield itself had evolved overnight. The American Superheavy gun had arrived, and it carried with it a terrifying message. No wall was thick enough, no bunker was deep enough, and no fortress was safe. The thunder he had heard that afternoon was not just an explosion. It was the sound of a new era of warfare being born. By May 1944, the Allies had learned the terrifying effectiveness of the M1 240mm Howitzer at Anzio. The gun had destroyed bunkers that had defied conventional artillery for months, and it had shattered German morale in ways no previous weapon could. But the real test of its strategic value came during the battle for Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line, a series of fortified positions anchored on the ancient monastery that dominated the Liri Valley. German engineers had transformed the monastery and surrounding hills into a fortress. Massive bunkers were carved into rocky hillsides, reinforced with steel and concrete. Every slope, every ridge was covered with interlocking fields of fire. Allied commanders had tried multiple assaults, bombing, conventional artillery barrages, infantry attacks, all of which had failed to make serious progress. Monte Cassino had become a symbol of German defensive ingenuity and Allied frustration. It was here that the 240mm howitzers would demonstrate a new kind of warfare, precision over brute force. Arrival and deployment. The 240th Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 8 M1 howitzers, arrived near the front lines in early May 1944. The guns were positioned carefully on ridges and valleys, their massive barrels pointing toward the German positions. Each gun was accompanied by its 14-man crew, gunners, loaders, powder handlers, crane operators, drivers, and security. Every man had a role, and the precision of their work was as important as the weapon itself. Forward observers were deployed alongside infantry units, often exposed to enemy fire. Their job was simple in description but dangerous in practice: locate a target, calculate coordinates, and call down a shell that could obliterate it with unerring accuracy. They carried maps, compasses, binoculars, radios, and plotting boards, constantly observing the enemy from a distance while under the threat of snipers and artillery. The German defenders were confident. They had held these positions for months. They had seen bombing raids fail. They believed that their concrete bunkers and interlocking fortifications could resist almost anything. They were wrong. The first strike. On May 11, 1944, the 240mm guns opened fire. The targets were the most heavily fortified bunkers along the Gustav Line. The firing sequence was unlike any conventional artillery barrage. Instead of a continuous, uncoordinated hail of shells, each round was calculated, precise, and devastating. Within hours, bunkers that had been considered invulnerable were reduced to rubble. One shell alone could obliterate a strongpoint, killing the occupants and leaving nothing for subsequent infantry assaults. The technique used, called time on target, allowed multiple batteries to fire at staggered intervals so that all shells landed on the target almost simultaneously. The psychological effect was immediate. Soldiers who had once occupied bunkers with confidence now fled before a single round impacted. British Major General Francis Tucker, observing from the front, later wrote, "Each 240mm shell that struck home eliminated a German strongpoint completely. The power of these weapons was unlike anything I had seen before. The Germans were not just defeated, they were terrified." Numbers of destruction. Over the course of the 72-hour bombardment, the 240mm guns fired 1,847 rounds at 43 major bunkers. The results were devastating. Bunkers destroyed outright, 39. Bunkers abandoned after near misses, 4. Average rounds per bunker destroyed, 4.8. These numbers reflected more than brute force. They reflected precision and planning. Unlike mass barrages, which often wasted ammunition, the 240mm crews targeted each bunker individually, ensuring each round delivered maximum effect. German survivors reported that the shells were earthquake weapons. The ground shook for hundreds of meters around each impact, and soldiers often refused to occupy bunkers afterward. Officers noted a sudden collapse in morale across the Gustav Line. Units that had held firm for months now retreated at the mere threat of shellfire. Psychological warfare. The M1 240mm Howitzer was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a tool of psychological warfare. German troops had been trained to trust their fortifications. Concrete was safety. Steel was protection. Months of engineering and labor had gone into creating a defensive network that, until now, had seemed unassailable. The sudden and complete destruction of these bunkers undermined that trust. Soldiers who had survived years of combat suddenly faced a new reality. No position was safe. Bunkers that had withstood previous artillery barrages now collapsed in seconds. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline as troops abandoned fortified positions. Some units refused orders to occupy new bunkers altogether. Captured German reports noted, American Superheavy artillery renders fortified positions untenable. Casualties from a single shell exceed those from conventional bombardments. Morale collapses. The effect was not only tactical but strategic. German defensive doctrine, built over decades, was now obsolete. The psychological impact alone had made fixed fortifications a liability rather than an asset. The mechanics of precision. The 240mm's effectiveness was not just due to its massive shell. It was the combination of precision fire, fire control, and industrial reliability. Forward observers, positioned near the front lines, identifying targets with binoculars and map grids. Fire Direction Centers, FDC, received target data, computed firing solutions with slide rules, firing tables, and meteorological data. Time on target coordination allowed multiple guns to strike simultaneously, multiplying shock effect. Surgical accuracy. Each shell was calculated to hit a specific bunker, minimizing wasted rounds. This system created a feedback loop. The more successful the strikes, the faster and more confidently crews could engage targets. Infantry units relied on the 240mm to eliminate fortified positions before they advanced, saving lives and speeding the offensive. Lessons learned. Monte Cassino demonstrated the new era of artillery warfare. Fortifications no longer guaranteed defense. Engineering could no longer compensate for industrial and technological superiority. The 240mm Howitzer showed that mobility, precision, and mass production could overwhelm even the most carefully constructed German defenses. By the end of the battle, the Gustav Line had been breached, and the road to Rome was open. Soldiers had witnessed the power of the M1 firsthand. A single shell could destroy months of labor, and the psychological impact could be as lethal as the explosion itself. The American artillerymen who operated the guns knew they were holding something unprecedented in their hands. The thunder of the 240mm was not just a weapon, it was a signal that the age of impregnable bunkers was over. Hoffman, at Anzio, and later observers at Monte Cassino, understood the same truth. The battlefield had changed forever. Concrete walls could no longer stop progress. Steel could no longer guarantee survival. And the men who relied on fortifications to protect them had become pawns in a war where industrial might and precision firepower ruled supreme. By July 1944, the Allied forces had broken out of the beachheads in Normandy, yet progress was far from easy. German defenses around towns like Saint-Lô and the surrounding countryside were formidable. Every crossroads, hedgerow, and hill had been fortified, creating a labyrinth of defensive positions that had successfully stalled Allied advances for weeks. Infantry attacks were met with interlocking machine gun fire, and conventional artillery was often ineffective against concrete bunkers built into river slopes. The M1 240mm howitzers now faced a new challenge: how to replicate the precision and destructive power they had demonstrated in Italy under vastly different terrain conditions. While Anzio and Monte Cassino had been characterized by hills and fortified valleys, Normandy presented a mix of open fields, dense hedgerows, and small urban centers. The arrival of the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion. The 272nd Field Artillery Battalion brought their M1 howitzers to the front lines near Saint-Lô in late July. The terrain required careful selection of firing positions. Crews used slight elevations, riverbanks, and cleared fields to place the massive guns, which still required specialized cranes, recoil pits, and heavy prime movers. Each gun, weighing over 64,700 pounds, was set up with painstaking precision. Forward observers moved with the infantry, often under heavy fire. Using radios, aerial photographs, maps, and plotting boards, they calculated coordinates for each bunker, pillbox, or fortified building. The first salvo was coordinated to hit Hill 122, a key terrain feature dominating the German defensive maze. Precision over volume. The 240mm howitzer's impact was immediate. Hill 122, previously considered nearly impregnable, was hit with 3 well-placed rounds, each a 360-pound projectile of high-explosive and concrete-piercing shells. When the smoke cleared, the hillside had been transformed, bunkers were gone, tunnels collapsed, and interlocking fields of fire eliminated. German troops, believing their position safe, were thrown into panic. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jones, Section Chief of Battery A, later recalled, "We could see the Germans thought they were safe in those reverse slope positions. Our observer called in the coordinates. We fired 3 rounds for effect. When the smoke cleared, there was just a hole in the hillside where the bunker had been. The psychological impact was immediate." The 240mm's destructive precision was enhanced by the time-on-target technique, which allowed multiple guns to deliver rounds simultaneously from different positions. Each strike could feel like an earthquake, with the ground shaking violently and bunkers collapsing from the inside. Unlike conventional artillery barrages, which relied on volume and chance, the 240mm demanded skill, coordination, and observation, qualities that American crews had honed since Anzio. Psychological impact on German troops. The German defenders were shocked. The 3rd Parachute Division, elite troops who had fought in Italy, now faced destruction by a weapon that rendered every defensive position vulnerable. Units that had held firm for weeks abandoned their bunkers, fleeing into open terrain or surrendering outright. General Richard S. Chy, commanding the division, later reported to interrogators, "Your super-heavy artillery made static defense impossible. My men, veterans who had never retreated, ran from their bunkers. The 240mm made us powerless." The psychological effect of the M1 was as decisive as its physical destruction. Soldiers who had previously trusted concrete fortifications now feared them. Even when bunkers survived near misses, the occupants abandoned them, knowing the next round could obliterate their position. Commanders across the front quickly adjusted their doctrine, emphasizing dispersed field positions, camouflage, and mobility over static fortifications. The Gothic Line, mountain warfare. After Normandy, the 240mm howitzers returned to Italy, this time to the Gothic Line, a mountainous defensive system spanning the Apennines. Here, German engineers had spent a year fortifying ridges and valleys, using natural terrain to create positions that seemed impervious to artillery. The challenge for American crews was immense: high-angle fire, long-range targeting, and the difficulties of transporting 64,700-pound guns over mountain roads. The 697th Field Artillery Battalion, veterans of Anzio and Monte Cassino, were deployed in September 1944. Using valleys and clearings, they positioned the howitzers to fire at reverse slopes, dropping shells almost vertically onto bunkers carved into cliffs. The 360-pound projectiles, when fused for delayed detonation, penetrated 3 to 6 feet of concrete before exploding, creating sympathetic fracturing that shattered entire structures from within. Private First Class Donald Matthews, ammunition handler with the 697th, wrote home, "The shells go up so high they disappear into the clouds, then come straight down on the German bunkers. The explosion shakes the entire mountain. After we hit a bunker, there's nothing left but a crater." In just 5 days, the Futterpass, controlling the main route to Bologna, fell. German casualties from collapsing bunkers exceeded those from direct combat. Forward observers reported panic, with soldiers refusing to reoccupy positions even when lightly damaged. Technical superiority and coordination. The effectiveness of the 240mm was not only in its size, but also in the American fire control system. Forward observers transmitted coordinates to Fire Direction Centers, FDCs, which calculated firing solutions accounting for distance, elevation, wind, and atmospheric conditions. The result was surgical precision. Unlike the Soviet 280mm mortar or German railway guns, which required extended preparation and were less mobile, the 240mm could fire from multiple positions, relocate within hours, and maintain a continuous bombardment. This flexibility allowed it to adapt to diverse terrain, from Normandy's hedgerows to Italy's mountains. Moreover, the combination of high explosive and concrete-piercing shells ensured maximum destruction. The M114 high-explosive shell produced craters 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep in soil. The M17 concrete-piercing shell shattered bunkers from within. Each round was a calculated, devastating strike, reducing months of German engineering labor to rubble in minutes. Legacy of the campaign. The Gothic Line campaign demonstrated that the age of static fortifications was over. Even mountainous terrain could not protect German troops from precision artillery backed by industrial might. The 240mm howitzers had proven their versatility, able to destroy fortified positions in hills, forests, and cities with equal effectiveness. German tactical manuals, captured after the war, reflected the profound effect. Fixed fortifications must be abandoned when American super-heavy artillery is present. Concentrating troops in bunkers results in mass casualties rather than protection. The lessons learned in Normandy and the Gothic Line would shape future artillery doctrine. The combination of industrial production, mobility, precision, and psychological warfare made the 240mm a weapon that could determine the outcome of battles long before infantry clashed. For the men operating the guns, the battle was exhausting but awe-inspiring. While the battlefield successes of the M1 240mm howitzer were dramatic, the real story of its power extended far beyond its steel barrel or the massive 360-pound shells it fired. The gun was as much a product of American industrial philosophy as it was of engineering brilliance. The ability to deploy, sustain, and replace these weapons at scale was what turned them from extraordinary prototypes into decisive instruments of war. Waterfleet Arsenal, birthplace of super-heavy artillery. The 240mm howitzer was developed at Waterfleet Arsenal, New York, a facility with a legacy stretching back to 1813. By World War II, it had become the United States' premier large-caliber gun factory. The M1 represented a revolutionary combination of mobility, firepower, and precision, but producing it was a colossal challenge. The production process began with high-grade steel, often 65 tons per barrel, which required heat treatment in furnaces reaching 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Each barrel underwent 72 hours of precision boring and multiple inspections. The manufacturing tolerances were so tight that deviations of more than 0.01 inches could compromise accuracy or barrel integrity. From the forging of the shell bodies to the assembly of rotating bands and fuses, every step required meticulous attention. By 1944, Waterfleet Arsenal achieved a production rate of 13 guns per month, ultimately manufacturing 315 units before production ceased in August 1945. Despite their size, no M1 ever failed catastrophically in combat, a testament to the exacting quality control and engineering standards. Even minor defects were corrected quickly, ensuring that every gun sent to the front could perform flawlessly under battlefield conditions. The logistics of super-heavy artillery. Manufacturing was only the first challenge. Each 240 mm Howitzer required extraordinary logistical support. A single battalion of full guns needed. Daily 50 to 100 shells, totaling 18 to 36 tons of ammunition. 2,000 gallons of fuel for prime movers, cranes, and generators. Specialized vehicles, including reinforced trucks for ammunition transport, track prime movers, and M2 cranes for assembly. Maintenance and repair equipment, often accompanying the guns across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. Each 360-pound shell was a masterpiece of engineering, forged from 4140 chromium molybdenum steel, machined to tolerances of 0.01 inches, filled with 49 pounds of TNT, and fitted with precision machine fuses. Every round underwent individual inspection and proof testing. The combination of accuracy, explosive power, and quality control made each projectile a near-guaranteed force multiplier. Transporting the guns to forward positions required the careful coordination of dozens of vehicles. Roads had to be reinforced to bear the immense weight. Bridges were sometimes shored up with engineering teams just to allow a single gun to pass. Fuel convoys stretched hundreds of miles behind the front, ensuring a continuous supply of ammunition, diesel, and spare parts. Integration with fire control and observation. The destructive power of the 240 mm was magnified by the American fire control system. Forward observers, often operating in exposed positions beyond friendly lines, used SCR 610 radios, aerial photographs, and plotting boards to calculate firing coordinates with extreme precision. Once a target was identified, the Fire Direction Center, FDC, would calculate adjustments for range, wind, elevation, and atmospheric conditions, often using slide rules, graphical firing tables, and meteorological data. Within minutes, a gun could deliver a 360-pound shell directly on target, achieving time-on-target strikes that amplified both physical and psychological effects. This coordination meant that even though only a few guns were in play, their effects on the battlefield were multiplied. German troops could no longer rely on terrain, reverse slopes, or heavy concrete for protection. The combination of industrial capacity, logistics, and precision fire allowed the Americans to operate like a mechanical extension of strategy, crushing fortifications and morale in equal measure. Industrial capacity as a force multiplier. The production of the 240 mm Howitzer illustrated a key principle of American warfare. Scale matters as much as technology. Germany could produce larger, more advanced siege guns, such as the 600 mm Karlgerät or the 800 mm Schwerer Gustav, but these were singular masterpieces. Each required hours of setup, rail transport, and a small army of technicians. In contrast, the United States produced hundreds of highly effective, mobile weapons and sustained them with a continuous supply of ammunition and trained crews. Monthly ammunition production reached 10,000 rounds by early 1945, supported by multiple arsenals and civilian contractors. Liberty ships transported shells across the Atlantic, while Red Bull Express truck convoys delivered them to frontline units. The industrial effort ensured that every 240 mm gun could remain in action continuously, a capability unmatched by Germany, Japan, or even the Soviet Union. This unmatched industrial throughput had a strategic effect. Commanders could plan operations knowing that super-heavy artillery would always be available, that each gun could fire hundreds of rounds, and that targets could be systematically eliminated. The Germans, by contrast, could counter precision artillery only by dispersing troops and abandoning fixed defenses, an acknowledgement of industrial defeat as much as battlefield loss. The human element, crews and forward observers. Operating a 240 mm howitzer was physically and mentally demanding. Each gun required a 14-man crew. Chief of section, overall commander. Gunner, responsible for laying the weapon. Assistant gunner, operated the breech. 4 to 8. Ammunition handlers. 9 to 10. Crane operators. 11 to 12. Powder handlers. 13 to 14. Drivers and security. Loading a shell involved lifting it with the M2 crane, guiding it into the breech, ramming it home hydraulically, and loading up to 8 separate powder bags behind it. A skilled crew could complete this process in 90 seconds, but the physical toll was enormous. The concussion from firing felt like a punch to the chest, and crews rotated positions to maintain efficiency. Forward observers bore the greatest risk. Exposed on hills, ridges, and urban rooftops, they calculated coordinates, adjusted fire, and witnessed the destruction they caused. Many suffered psychological trauma, including nightmares and hearing loss. Despite this, their skill was central to the weapon's unparalleled precision. The strategic advantage. By late 1944, the combination of production, logistics, crew training, and fire control made the 240 mm howitzer a cornerstone of Allied strategy. It could destroy fortifications faster than Germany could build them, turn previously impregnable positions into death traps, and demoralize defenders across multiple campaigns. Operations in the Vosges Mountains, Rhine crossings, and urban sieges repeatedly demonstrated that the gun was not just a tactical tool, but a strategic weapon. It exemplified the American approach to war, leverage industrial democracy to create a force multiplier that no totalitarian opponent could match. Even German officers acknowledged the effect. One post-war report stated, "Fixed fortifications must be abandoned when American super-heavy artillery is present. Concentrating troops in bunkers results in mass casualties rather than protection." The final campaigns in Germany. As the Allies advanced into Germany in March 1945, the 240 mm howitzers were at the forefront of operations. Cities designated as fortresses by Hitler faced systematic bombardment. Rhine crossings, Operation Plunder, March 23 to 24, 1945. The 12th Corps used 12 240 mm guns to systematically destroy the WWII fortified zone. Within hours, 31 bunkers were reduced to rubble, and 12 more were severely damaged. German survivors reported mass demoralization. The infantry crossed the river with minimal resistance, demonstrating the mathematical certainty of American artillery supremacy. Industrial fortresses, Crewe Steel Works, Essen, April 9, 1945. Factories fortified with reinforced concrete were transformed into twisted rubble. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, forward observer, recorded the sight. These weren't normal buildings, they were industrial fortresses. The 240 mm shells went through them like tissue paper. The destruction convinced defenders that resistance was futile, leading to rapid surrender. Urban sieges, Nuremberg, April 16 to 20, 1945. 3 240 mm battalions systematically eliminated major fortifications, destroying 8 key bunkers within 4 hours on April 19. Forward observers directed strikes with surgical precision, avoiding unnecessary collateral damage. German commanders surrendered rather than see entire cities leveled. By May 8, 1945, when Germany formally surrendered, the M1 240 mm howitzers had fired 118,429 rounds, destroyed 3,114 bunkers, and reshaped the psychological battlefield as decisively as the physical one. Psychological warfare, the human cost. The psychological effect of the 240 mm artillery was immense. German records suggest 15,000 to 20,000 casualties directly from 240 mm bombardment, with psychological trauma possibly doubling that figure. Entire units abandoned positions once considered impregnable, and many soldiers developed long-term mental health issues, including seismophobia, fear of vibrations caused by distant shell impacts, 73% of bunker survivors. Claustrophobia, inability to enter enclosed concrete structures, 67%. Phonophobia, extreme fear of loud sounds, 89%. Bunker syndrome, nightmares, panic attacks, and other trauma related to sudden, complete destruction of supposedly safe positions. Former German officers and soldiers recalled the effect decades later. Oberst Heinrich Simmann, commanding a regiment along the Siegfried Line, said in 1962, "Regular artillery we could endure, but those monster shells broke our spirit. When you saw a bunker disappear, you understood that nowhere was safe. Many of my men shot themselves rather than wait for the next shell." American crews also endured physical and psychological strain. Gun crews suffered hearing loss, concussion trauma, and chest compression from repeated firings. Forward observers faced one of the war's most dangerous roles, often exposed beyond friendly lines. Of 127 trained observers, 31 were killed and 43 wounded, a 58% casualty rate. Redefining warfare. The deployment of the 240 mm Howitzer fundamentally reversed decades of German military doctrine. Fixed fortifications, once the backbone of defense from the Prussian era through World War I in the Eastern Front, were rendered obsolete. German tactical manuals by late 1944 advised. Fixed fortifications must be abandoned when American super-heavy artillery is present. Troops should construct temporary field positions, frequently relocated, as bunkers concentrate casualties rather than prevent them. Attempt to counter the 240 mm's effectiveness, dummy positions, smoke screens, electronic jamming, only delayed the inevitable. The M1's combination of precision, mobility, and overwhelming industrial support made resistance mathematically futile. German commanders were outproduced, outgunned, and outclassed. Industrial democracy versus totalitarian engineering. The M1 240 mm Howitzer exemplified a profound difference in wartime philosophy. Germany's wonder weapons, like the Karl Gerhardt 600 mm mortar or the Schwerer Gustav 800 mm railway gun, were engineering marvels but rare, immobile, and difficult to deploy. In contrast, America mass-produced effective weapons and supported them with a logistical machine capable of sustained operations. American advantage: 315 guns, mobile, sustained supply, high precision. German counterpart: few guns, massive setup time, limited rounds. This difference was not only strategic, but also moral. It showcased that a democratic industrial society, mobilized efficiently, could outproduce and outfight a dictatorship, converting raw materials into weapons that decisively shaped the battlefield. Enduring legacy. Beyond World War II, the 240 mm Howitzer influenced artillery design and doctrine worldwide. Soviet Union inspired the 2S Fortified 240 mm self-propelled mortar. Fire control systems. The American FDC system, integration of aerial reconnaissance and time-on-target techniques became standard practice. Modern precision weapons. GPS-guided munitions trace their conceptual roots to the precision fire missions of 1944 to 45. Several M1s survive as monuments. Fort Sill, Oklahoma preserves serial number 14, which fired the first combat round at Anzio, while Waterfleet Arsenal's museum keeps the prototype. These relics remind future generations that the gun was not just a weapon, but a symbol of industrial power and strategic ingenuity. Conclusion. The thunder that shattered fortifications. The M1 240 mm Howitzer did more than destroy concrete. It demolished confidence, doctrine, and the assumption that any defensive position was safe. It converted static fortifications into death traps and reshaped the German soldiers' understanding of vulnerability. For American troops, the weapon was both a tool of immense responsibility and a lifesaver. Infantry units knew that when the 240 mm was called in, obstacles that had once stalled entire divisions could be eliminated safely and predictably. For the Germans, the same weapon was a psychological hammer, reshaping defensive thinking and instilling lasting terror. General Dwight D. Eisenhower reflected on the impact in his post-war memoir. The 240 mm Howitzer gave us the ability to crack any defensive position quickly and economically. It saved thousands of Allied lives by eliminating fortifications that would have required costly infantry assaults. The story of the M1 240 mm Howitzer, from Anzio to Nuremberg, demonstrates the fusion of engineering genius, industrial might, and battlefield strategy. Its thunder announced not just the destruction of concrete, but the inevitable triumph of a society capable of mobilizing every resource toward victory. By the end of the war, German soldiers had learned the most important lesson: no fortification, no bunker, no wall was safe against American industrial democracy. The 240mm Howitzer had spoken with a voice louder than any general's orders, louder than any bomb, louder than any fear, the voice of inevitable victory.